What did the Washington Mystics do on draft night? How do the team's free agency moves set up training camp? Jen Hatfield, Mystics beat writer at The Next, joins host Natalie Heavren to chat all things Mystics, as well as catch up on what's happening around the Ivy League.
Ogunbowale for the win. Good!
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Hello and happy Friday. You are locked on to women's basketball. I'm Natalie Heavren and I'm a features writer and the Atlantic 10 beat reporter for The Next. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today, we'll be chatting about the Washington Mystics draft night, who the team signed in free agency and how that impacts the team heading into training camp, and catch up on some of the happenings around the Ivy League. Joining me today is Jen Hatfield, managing editor, Washington Mystics beat writer, and Ivy League beat writer at The Next. The weather is warm, or at least it is in the DC area, and the WNBA season starts in exactly 4 weeks, so I'm very excited to have you join me today. Starting off, training camp begins in just over a week. To help catch our listeners up and set the scene, heading into the draft, what were the Mystics' needs or goals?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back on the podcast, Natalie. Can confirm it is very warm in the DC area, which means it's just about WNBA time. So heading into this year's draft, the Mystics honestly didn't really have many needs at all. They returned their top 5 scorers from last season and some good bench pieces. Heading into free agency, they'd wanted to address the offense, in particular the three-point shooting, and pick up the pace a little bit. And they also wanted to stay really tough on the defensive end. They led the league in defensive rating last season, so they wanted to keep that up. And by and large, they addressed that in free agency. So by the time they got to the draft, there wasn't anything mission critical that they felt that they needed for this season.
And next, can you take us through what the Mystics did on draft night and how the team set themselves up, not only for this season, but future seasons as well?
Yeah, so the Mystics had 3 picks, 1 in each round, and they essentially divided them up to have 2 be with an eye toward the future and 1 for someone who could help immediately this season if she makes the roster. So in the first round, they selected Stephanie Suarez from Iowa State, but immediately flipped her to Dallas for a 2024 second-round pick and a 2025 first-round pick. They drafted her knowing that she was going to go to Dallas. The trade had been finalized moments prior. And the logic behind that is because the team is so deep this season, General Manager Mike Tebows didn't want to be in a position where he had to decide between cutting the number 4 overall pick and getting nothing in return for it, or potentially cutting another player that they really liked and wanted to keep that's currently on their roster. So instead of risking walking away with empty-handed from a first-round pick, he was able to flip it into future assets, which could be really useful in 2024 and 2025 as the Mystics' current core naturally gets a little older. Some free agent decisions are coming up. He calculated that having those future draft assets would be much more valuable to him than having them this season. So that was the first round pick. And then the other pick that was made with an eye toward the future was Chel Alarcon in the 3rd round. She's a 19-year-old guard from Spain who shoots the 3 really well. She's not going to come to training camp this year. She's going to stay home, continue to develop, but the Mystics retain her rights. So in the future, if the Mystics say, oh, wow, she's really developed and gotten to a place where we think she can help us this year, they can bring her over to training camp. They won't have to, she won't be a free agent. They have her rights. And then, so the last pick, the second round pick is the one that could help the Mystics this season. They drafted Elena Chineke from South Florida. And she's a guard. R. Hunter Cruz and M. Adler, in their big draft board that they released just before the draft, they compared her to Courtney Williams, and not just because they are both South Florida alums, But Hunter and Em kind of described Chineke as a crafty, competitive guard, a good three-point shooter, but also a good driver, can finish at the rim. So she will compete for a place on the roster this season.
So, with that in mind, with Alcaron not coming over this year, do you expect, or is it expected, that Chineke has a chance to make the roster out of training camp?
Yes, I think the way that the roster sets up, she has a good shot at claiming one of the final 2 roster spots or so. I think the top 9 is fairly clear, and then they'll have 2 spots for a number of players. And I think she kind of has an inside track toward one of those. The only thing is she's probably going to need a nickname with Elena Deladon on the roster, so they'll have to sort that one out.
Yeah, that was definitely something, not my first reaction, but one of my first reactions. I was like, this seems like confusion like the Sun had in years past with multiple Joneses and multiple Thomases. What was the general feeling from the Mystics after the draft? Did it go the way that they were hoping it did, or they wanted to, or were there some surprises along the way?
I think they were pretty satisfied with what they'd accomplished, very businesslike in the press conference. They were happy they could flip that number 4 pick for future assets and feel like they helped themselves, as much as you can expect from second and third round picks, who are often not players who make rosters, maybe with a slight exception for the Mystics, given how productive Mike Tebow has been with his second rounders. But yeah, I think there was some satisfaction with the way that things played out, and not the jubilation that you get when you pick a player you really want in the lottery, but definitely a feeling that they did what they needed to do.
Yeah, that definitely a very Mike Tebow-esque move, and I just want to pull out a quote that he said from your story. I think the depth of those drafts, referring to the 2024 and 2025, could be very significant, particularly in 25, and we have 2 first-round picks now. We have 3 firsts in a 2-year period, and having multiple firsts allows you to have more options. Those options in the 2024 and 2025 drafts are expected to include Caitlin Clark, Paige Beckers, Itzy Cudd, Cameron Brink, Olivia Miles, Anissa Morrow. So can you go into a little more detail about what kind of options having 3 firsts in a 2-year period allows the Mystics in what could be a very transformational 2 years of drafts in the WNBA?
Yeah, definitely. So they could use all 3 of those picks, certainly if they decide to, particularly depending next offseason. Elena Deladon, Ariel Atkins, and Natasha Cloud are all free agents. And you're not going to necessarily replace players like that, like for like in the draft with a college player. That's a tall ask even for some of those superstars that you named. But drafting first round replacements could go a long way if any of those players do end up leaving in free agency, or in the case of Deladon, retiring. They could also do the Mike Tebow special and flip some of those first round picks for other players or other draft picks, or whatever Mike Tebow pulls out of his wizard hat for those. And he expressed excitement at having that flexibility as well to repackage and resort the picks that he got in this trade stemmed back to the previous trade that he made last season for when they had the number 1 overall pick in 2022. So he is not shy in dealing picks and just enjoys having the flexibility to do what he thinks he needs to do to improve his roster.
And this is Mike Tebow's first year just as general manager. Do you think his moves were any different now that he's not also wearing the coach's hat, but instead setting up his son, Eric Tebow, who's now the head coach of the Mystics?
I don't think so. Mike and Eric have pretty similar coaching philosophies. They like similar players. The Mystics kind of have a brain trust, quote unquote, that has been running the show for a while with Mike, Eric, and Maria Giovanetti, who's now the assistant GM. So those 3 were and have been the decision makers for the Mystics on this year's draft night and in the past. So nothing really changed in that respect. And I think Mike Tebow may feel it a little more honestly during the season if there are any moves that need to be made, not having to also then coach the team after making moves like that. There may be a little bit less juggling on his part. But as far as draft night, it was a pretty typical feeling for all of them as well. Eric said the same thing, that it didn't feel much different being the head coach for this draft because he has had so much input over the years in picking players.
Thank you so much for that. Coming up next, we'll discuss the Mystics' free agency and how it sets the team up for training camp this season. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Nissan's Most Electric Player of the Week is brought to you by the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. This week's player is Breanna Stewart. In the EuroLeague title game, she scored 35 points in 35 minutes, going 10 of 17 from the floor and 5 of 5 from 3. She added 6 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 steals, helping Fenerbahce to the championship win 99-60. Much like the Nissan Ariya, Stewart is built fierce, winning her second EuroLeague title and Final Four MVP in 3 seasons last weekend. Stewart, like the Ariya, delivers on duality, and the vehicle is the perfect combination of fierceness and elegance, beautiful but strong. Perfect SUV crossover. The 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin-to-your-seat power and premium intelligence all in one EV. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya is the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Taking a step back, Jen, who did the Mystics sign in free agency, since we haven't quite gotten to talk about that yet on the podcast?
Yeah, so there are kind of 2 categories. They did some basic re-signings of players that they had last year, and then they signed some mostly new, but also new and old talent. So in the straightforward re-signing players, they brought back guard Shatori Walker-Kimbrough and forward Tiana Hawkins. Walker-Kimbrough's contract is protected this season, which is notable for her. She's been someone who's bounced around the league a little bit since being drafted by Washington. She was originally on the move in that Tina Charles trade in 2020. And so this is kind of a signal that she's solidified her place a little bit more with the Mystics. So that's a great contributor coming back. And then Tiana Hawkins is on a veteran minimum 1-year deal, also known as a training camp contract, and she's going to be in contention. She's going to be battling for a roster spot, but I expect her to make the roster to provide depth in the front court, but also just she's an amazing locker room presence from talking to teammates and coaches. She brings something unquantifiable to that locker room, and they really value that. So those 2 players were important to re-sign to give them depth. And then the new additions all have Los Angeles Sparks ties. They picked up guard Brittany Sykes, who was the marquee signing of their offseason, a 3-year fully guaranteed deal at almost $200,000 a year. It's a big signing. She brings a lot of things. She adds defense, which did the Mystics need more defense? Probably not, but they'll take it. Like, you can never have too much defense, right? Especially with Alicia Clark leaving in free agency. She also brings speed and driving ability to address the Mystics' desire to pick up the pace this season. She's not, though, a great 3-point shooter, and that's where Christy Tolliver comes in, a new old face to the Mystics, won the 2019 title with the Mystics before going back to the Sparks, and is now coming back to the Mystics. She technically has not signed her contract yet because she only recently finished her NBA coaching obligations with the Dallas Mavericks, but Mike Tebows said on draft night that she is expected to sign before training camp starts and be on time to camp. And so she'll provide that veteran leadership and some much needed 3-point shooting, likely off the bench. And then last but not least, the Mystics signed Amanda Zawi-B to give their front court a much needed boost of size off the bench. She'll kind of fill the Elizabeth Williams role off the bench for folks who are familiar with last season's Mystics. And, just she'll have an opportunity. I talked to her recently, and she told me she wants to kind of find herself in the WNBA again. She didn't play last season, not by her own choice, and she's ready to like come in and kind of be reborn in the WNBA in a way. So she's going to be a really big piece in their front court, figuratively and literally.
And how many people can the Mystics afford to carry this season? I know some WNBA teams can carry 11, some 12, and that obviously impacts how training camp goes.
Yes, the Mystics are one of those teams that can only carry 11 this season. I've done the salary cap math myself on that one. What is good for the Mystics, even though they can only carry 11, is that of the players whose deals are not guaranteed, the money works for them to take whoever they want. They're not in a place like some teams have been over the years where the salary cap is so tight that they can only take certain combinations of players who are on their camp rosters, because if they take players who are even $1,000 more expensive than another player, they go over the cap. So the Mystics do have a little bit of flexibility there, in part because they have a lot of players in their camp who are relatively inexperienced in the WNBA, many of them rookies to the WNBA, and so they are on cheaper minimum contracts than your WNBA veterans.
And who do you think has the opportunity to prove themselves at training camp this season, fighting for some of those unprotected roster spots?
Yeah, so I think Amanda Zawi, I just mentioned her. I think she has a lot she wants to show people, and I think it could be a really great opportunity for her. So her offseason has been a little bit wild. She started with LA this offseason. Her rights were held by them. She ended up getting flipped to Las Vegas in the Deorica Hamby trade, which kind of put her in a situation where she probably wasn't going to play a whole lot with how deep their roster is. And so she was looking at other options as well. And the Mystics wanted her and made the trade happen. And now she has signed a minimum contract, and she should get an opportunity to play and show what she can do. So she's got an opportunity and just needs to run with it. And she's really excited to be in DC, and especially with the other LA folks coming with her, that gives her a sense of comfort as well. And then I think looking farther down the roster, I mentioned Chineke, and I think she, in combination with the other, so there's Chineke, and then there's 5 other players competing for, in all likelihood, 2 spots. And so I think that battle is going to be really interesting. Of those 6 players, 3 of them have some experience with the Mystics on short-term contracts, Jasmine Jones, Stephanie Jones, and Avina Westbrook. So that may give them somewhat of an advantage there. You've also got Li Meng, who's a sharpshooter from China. Mystics love their international players, so she'll have a chance. And then the last one is Alicia Jenkins. So that will make camp really fun and competitive, and it'll be interesting to see who emerges out of that group.
And, what are some other storylines that you're watching in training camp?
Yeah, I think the big one for me is what Shakira Austin does in year 2. She's still going to have, last year, one could argue that she didn't get the chance to show everything she was capable of because she was playing with so much talent around her. And she's going to have that same problem this year. I guess I should put problem in air quotes, right? But she's been crushing it in Israel in the off season, and I'm expecting her to have just a really big year. Even with the depth around her, I think she can take another step up, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. And then just from a health perspective, curious how Maisha Hines-Allen is doing, recovering from knee surgery in September. It sounded like, based on what Mike Tebows said on draft night, that she is doing well in her recovery, but is not full go yet. She's doing drills with coaches, but she's not in live action at this point, and they're going to be cautious with her in training camp. So monitoring that recovery is going to be a storyline. And then when she is healthy, I'm curious to see, last year was somewhat of a struggle for her at times, and I'm curious to see how she rebounds from that and what she can produce, especially if and when that knee is fully healthy. It sounds like it may have hampered her a little bit last year. And then while we're on the topic of health, of course, we have to mention Elena Deladon, who appears to be fully healthy with her back injury. No setbacks this offseason or anything like that. She's currently full go, according to Tebows. So we'll see, whether she needs to sit out games again this season or whether she can be more of an everyday player. And that's going to be something to watch as well. I think, quite honestly, probably for the rest of her career.
Coming up next, we'll pivot and chat a little bit about the Ivy League, because how could we bring Jen on and not talk about Ivy League news, including coaching news as well as the transfer portal. Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So Jen, the Mystics aren't your only beat. So while you're here, I have a few Ivy League questions for you, starting off with the latest Ivy coaching news. It was announced earlier this week, Adrian Scheibels of Dartmouth stepped down. What does this mean for the program, especially as it comes after many programs have already hired a head coach?
Yeah, so this news was a little bit surprising to me. And unfortunately, I think the big impact here is it really resets the rebuild that Dartmouth was on. So Scheibels had been at Dartmouth for the past 2 seasons, and she'd gone 5-49, which is not great by any stretch of the imagination. But also Dartmouth had struggled for over a decade before she got there. So it's not like they, were suddenly really good and then she came and then they weren't anymore. This is a program that she knew she was going to have to come in and build, and was kind of working on it. Even though the results weren't there in terms of wins and losses, Dartmouth did look better in some statistical categories this season than they had the season before. So it seemed like there was some optimism that they would soon turn a corner in some respects. And I'm frankly a little bit surprised that she didn't get a third year to kind of keep building that culture and recruit players and all that goes into that. So as far as kind of a big picture, in the Ivy League, Brown and Dartmouth have been kind of the 2 programs that have been linked as programs that are rebuilding from the bottom. They got new head coaches a year apart, with Brown's coming a year earlier. And Brown really turned a corner this season. Their statistics look better across the board. They upset Penn. They played Florida Gulf Coast tight in the non-conference. They showed clear signs of progress. And I had expected Dartmouth to show some similar, kind of follow a similar trajectory next year. But now with Scheibels gone, it obviously depends who they hire and what kind of continuity or not they achieve. But as of right now, it looks like that is up in the air, and they may be kind of back at square one as far as their building process goes.
And just around the same time, Megan Griffith of Columbia, who we've talked about a lot, also recently signed a 5-year contract extension. For those that may not know, how has she impacted the program during her tenure, and what does the extension mean for both her and Columbia?
Yeah, very well deserved. In short, Megan Griffith has been everything to Columbia. This stat is wild, but in the 25 seasons before Meg got to Columbia as its head coach in 2016, Columbia won 28% of its games. It was really rough. Columbia did not have much of a history in Division I to speak of. And so, kind of like Scheibels, Meg started off with a couple building seasons, I should say, at Columbia, where she was kind of, implementing what she wanted to run, recruiting players, all that stuff that goes into building a program up. And in her fourth season, the Lions broke through, qualified for the Ivy League tournament before COVID scrapped that. And then the last two seasons have been the best in the program's Division I history. They made their first two WNIT appearances. They were Ivy League regular season co-champions this year for the first time ever. They made the WNIT final this year. They broke lots of records. Griffith is now the winningest head coach in program history. On and on. They received votes in national polls. It's hard to understate how much they've been transformed, really. And so the extension means that Griffith gets to keep building Columbia into this power in the conference, in the region, and Griffith hopes in the nation. She and her team feel like there's unfinished business still. They set a goal before last season even started to make the NCAA tournament, and they fell one loss shy of that. So that's definitely on their radar. They want to crack the top 25, as Princeton has done from time to time. So essentially, this extension, in my opinion, keeps Columbia relevant. If Griffith had left for another school, who knows the direction that Columbia would have gone, and that's not a slight on any other coach. It's just looking at what Griffith has built here. So that's a big thing for Columbia, and it's big for the Ivy League as well.
And another big item is the transfer portal. It's a huge topic of conversation around the country. Who are some key transfers that have left the Ivy League, and where have they ended up?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of Ivy players in the portal as grad transfers because the Ivy League generally does not allow graduate students to compete. So any players who graduate with remaining eligibility need to spend that eligibility outside the conference. And the number of players who are in that situation has increased during the COVID era because the Ivy League didn't play in 2020, 2021. So with that said, we've got over a dozen players in the portal from the Ivy League as grads, 5 commitments so far, and 3 of those players have committed to Power 6 programs. Columbia's Jada Patrick, a second-team All-Ivy performer this year on the wing. She's headed to Miami, so she goes back to the ACC. She started her career at Duke before transferring to Columbia, and now she's going to go play for Katie Meyer. The fun story there is that this past season, Columbia beat Miami at Miami in a Thanksgiving tournament, and Patrick scored 25 points on the Canes. So now she's going to try to score 25 points for the Canes, I suppose. And another player on the move to the ACC is Yale's Camilla Emsbo, who as a junior, she was a unanimous first-team All-Ivy player coming into the season. She was a front runner for Ivy Player of the Year, but then she tore her ACL and missed the entire season, which is how she has the year of eligibility. So she, like I said, is headed to Duke, will be huge for Kara Lawson's defense in particular. Emsbo is very good defensively, a great shot blocker and rebounder, in addition to her scoring. And then the last Ivy to Power 6 transfer, at least for the moment, is Cornell's Shannon Mulroy, a Jersey native headed to Seton Hall to play her final year, which I think is kind of a great fit in the sense that Mulroy is a gritty, scrappy player who kind of defined that tough style that Cornell plays and will fit right in at a Jersey program. So that's what we have so far. There are still several players left to commit. And by the way, I should say, like, this Ivy League to Power 6 path is not an aberration for the Ivy League. Just since 2018-19, every Ivy program has sent at least one player to a Power 6 school.
And you mentioned that quite a few players have yet to commit to a new school. Who headlines that list for you?
Yeah, so there are lots of players I could talk about, but I think the obvious two to start with are reigning first-team All-Ivy players, Kayla Padilla from Penn and Caitlin Davis from Columbia, both of whom are expected to go also to Power 6 programs. So it'll be interesting to see where both of them end up. Padilla's from California and Davis is from Connecticut. In case they end up wanting to go home, that could be relevant. And then also I'll throw in Harvard's Mackenzie Forbes. who is a guard who started her career at Cal before transferring to Harvard. Did not make an All-Ivy team this year. I think that was the biggest snub on the All-Ivy list. But she is also getting Power 6 interest, and we'll see where she ends up as well.
And, obviously the season just ended just over a month ago for Ivy teams. But what are you expecting from Ivy League women's basketball next year?
Oh, it's going to be fun. If you're not going to watch it, you're going to miss out. So you got to plan to get ESPN Plus and get dialed in here. I think it's going to be a really competitive season in 2023-24. I think there's going to be a group of 3 teams who are, in my mind, very clearly at the top right now in some order in Princeton, Harvard, and Columbia. We'll see if the incoming freshmen across the league have something to say about that. But yeah, as of right now, I see it as a clear top 3, which makes for a really fun battle for the 4 spot because the Ivy League tournament only takes the top 4. So who is that kind of mystery team going to be? Will it be Penn? Will it be Yale? Could Brown sneak in? Who knows? And then we've also got most of the All-Ivy honorees coming back, and we have every major award winner coming back. So that's your Player of the Year, your Defensive Players of the Year, your Rookie of the Year, and Griffith was Coach of the Year. So all of those folks are coming back. So there's going to be some nice experience, even as all those grad transfers depart. And also, on the coaching side, I think it's an exciting time to tune into Ivy League basketball. Along with whoever replaces Scheibels, there's just a lot of new kind of fresh coaching in the league. Next season, 3 coaches will be in their first or second seasons. And we've got several more who are early in their Ivy League careers as well. So that's just injecting a fun dynamic into the league where we see new systems and programs, are trying to rise and challenge the established powers. So Griffith is kind of ahead of others in that respect on her climb to challenge Princeton, but more are coming up through the woodwork every day. So it'll be a really interesting race for the title and for all the spots down from there, I think, with a lot of really standout players coming back.
And to wrap us up, what stories do you have in progress? I'm sure it's a few, just because it's you.
Yes, I do have a lot. We were just talking about the Ivy League, so I will have kind of an Ivy League off-season roundup coming soon that will give you more information on the grad transfers and a whole host of other things. And then on the Mystics side, I've got a couple things in progress there as well. You'll get a season preview from me closer to the start of the WNBA season. And then I've also got a special family rivalry story on a pair of sisters that should be dropping any day now. So that one should be very fun. Spoiler alert, I'll tell you, it begins with some fun superstitions that they have on the court. So if that piques your interest. But yeah, I've got a lot of things in the hopper. That's just a little bit of a preview.
I am so excited for your family story, as well as the rest of the stuff coming down. I'll keep my eye on my email, and our listeners should as well. Thank you for joining me today, Jen. Where can the people find you and your work?
Yeah, so obviously head to the Next, which is thenexthoops.com. You can find me there. And on social media, I'm primarily on Twitter at Jen Hatfield1. That's Jen with 2 N's. So yeah, those are the top 2 places you can find me.
Thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. Everydayers, tomorrow on the show, make sure to tune in to hear from Hunter and Em, our 2 WNBA draft experts who I always learn so much from. They're already starting their 2024 WNBA draft coverage. There are no off days for the 2 of them.